Somebody typed a question into an AI chatbot, and a rumor started that has now been watched by millions of people. The claim spreading across YouTube right now is that scientists fed Grok, the AI built by Elon Musk's company XAI, every scan and survey ever taken of an ancient site in Turkey, and that the machine came back with a discovery so explosive it rewrites human history. A hidden star map, a comet warning, a lost civilization erased from the record. It is a great story. There is just one problem. It never happened. There's no published study, no research team, no named scientist who ran this experiment. It is a myth built to look like news, and I want to be straight with you about that before we go any further. Because the real place at the center of this rumor does not need an invented miracle to be extraordinary. Its name is Göbekli Tepe, and what has actually been dug out of that hillside in southeastern Turkey over the last 30 years is stranger, better documented, and more genuinely mysterious than anything a chatbot could have told you. So let's put the myth down and look at the real evidence, because the true story is the one that actually changes how we think about the beginning of civilization. The discovery starts in 1994 on a dry, sun-bleached ridge outside the city of Şanlıurfa, close to the Syrian border. A local farmer noticed strange stone slabs breaking the surface of a hill his family had worked for. Generations, ground that had already been surveyed once in the 1960s by a team from the University of Chicago and Istanbul University. That earlier survey noted broken limestone slabs on the hilltop and assumed they were grave markers from a medieval cemetery. Unremarkable, not worth excavating. It was a reasonable guess, and it was completely wrong. When the German Archaeological Institute followed up on the new reports, they sent an archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt to take a look. Schmidt had already excavated Neolithic sites in the region, and the moment he saw the flat, worked surfaces poking out of the ground, he understood that whatever this was, it was not a graveyard. He began systematic excavation, and in 1995. Schmidt would go on to spend the rest of his working life on that hill, publishing on it for nearly 2 decades until his death in 2014. And the site he uncovered has been reshaping the timeline of human civilization ever since. Before Schmidt, the accepted model of how civilization began was tidy and linear, and most of it still shows up in textbooks today in a softened form. Humans, the story went, spent tens of thousands of years as small, mobile hunter-gatherer bands. Eventually, somewhere around 10,000 years ago, some of those bands in the Fertile Crescent began domesticating wheat, barley, sheep, and goats. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus food allowed people to stop moving and settle in one place. Settling down led populations to grow. Growing populations eventually needed social organization, which produced hierarchy, specialization, and eventually the labor and planning capacity to build monuments, temples, and cities. Religion and grand architecture, in this model, were a late-stage luxury, something farming societies built once they had free time and surplus grain to spare. It's a clean sequence. Economy first, then society, then belief, then monuments. Göbekli Tepe simply does not fit anywhere on that timeline, because it predates confirmed, developed agriculture in the region by a significant margin, and yet it required exactly the kind of coordinated, large-scale labor that the old model said should only exist after farming had already reorganized society. That contradiction is the single most important thing about this site, more important than any individual carving, because it means the sequence itself may be backward, or at least far messier than the textbook version allows. What came out of the ground was a set of massive stone enclosures. Radiocarbon dating places the oldest confirmed layers at roughly 11,500 years old, meaning construction began somewhere around 9600 BCE, in the earliest phase of what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic. To put that in context, that predates the pyramids of Giza by about 7,000 years and predates Stonehenge by roughly 6,000 years. When these structures went up, the last ice age had only just loosened its grip on the planet. Agriculture, in any developed form, did not yet exist in this region. Pottery had not been invented. The wheel was thousands of years away, and according to the conventional model of how civilization develops, the people living here should have been small, mobile bands of hunter-gatherers with no capacity for large, coordinated construction projects. Göbekli Tepe does not fit that model, and it has forced archaeologists to rewrite it rather than ignore it. The enclosures themselves are built around massive limestone pillars carved into a distinctive T-shape, a wide crossbar sitting atop a narrower shaft. The largest confirmed pillars stand around 18 feet tall and are estimated to weigh somewhere in the range of 10 to 20 tons, with some unfinished. Pillars still sitting in the nearby quarry, never fully freed from the bedrock. That would have been considerably heavier. These were not raw boulders stood on end. They were dressed, shaped, and in many cases covered in relief carvings, animal figures rendered with real skill. foxes, boars, snakes, scorpions, cranes, vultures with wings spread, and abstract symbols whose meaning is still debated. Look closely at the central pillars in several enclosures, and you can see stylized arms carved down the sides, bending at the elbow, with hands meeting near where a belt would sit on a human torso. These are not just monuments. Most archaeologists now read them as monumental representations of beings, ancestral or supernatural figures, standing at the center of each ring, and this is not speculation dressed up as fact. Schmidt himself proposed this interpretation early on, and later excavation of similar T-pillar figures at nearby sites, some with clothing and belt buckles carved in far more detail, has reinforced it. The carvings themselves deserve more attention than a quick mention, because they're where the site stops being just an engineering puzzle and starts looking like a window into how these people actually thought. The animal imagery is not random decoration scattered across the stone. Certain species cluster on certain pillars and in certain enclosures, and researchers have long noted that dangerous, wild, and predatory animals dominate the imagery. Foxes bearing teeth, boars, snakes coiled in bundles, scorpions with tails raised, and vultures, wings fully extended, appearing again and again across multiple enclosures. Domesticated or docile animals are essentially absent, which makes sense since domestication itself hadn't happened yet, but even wild grazing animals like deer are comparatively rare compared to predators and dangerous or carrion-associated species. Several archaeologists, including Schmidt himself, have suggested this imagery may relate to death, danger, and the boundary between the human world and something more threatening or sacred beyond it, possibly connected to funerary practice, since vultures in particular are associated in later Near Eastern cultures with excarnation, the practice of exposing the dead to be stripped by birds before burial. That's an interpretation, not a certainty, but it's grounded in comparative anthropology rather than invented from nothing. Then there are the abstract symbols, H-shapes, crescents, and repeating geometric marks carved alongside the animals, whose meaning nobody has convincingly decoded. Some researchers have proposed they function as a kind of proto-notation or symbolic vocabulary shared across the site, a way of marking meaning without being a written language, in the way we'd recognize one. Others are far more cautious, arguing there simply isn't enough comparative material yet to distinguish a genuine symbolic system from decorative convention repeated by tradit ion. Both positions are represented in the current academic literature, and neither one has won the argument. Here is the part of the story that should genuinely unsettle you, and it doesn't need any embellishment. No metal tools existed anywhere in this region at the time these pillars were shaped. Metallurgy was thousands of years in the future. There were no draft animals to help haul stone because animal domestication had not yet occurred. There was no wheel to move loads across the ground. And crucially, there is no earlier tradition of monumental stone construction anywhere in the archaeological record that this could have evolved from. As far as excavation has shown, nothing like this existed before it. Experimental archaeologists, TIAs who have tried to replicate Neolithic stoneworking techniques using stone hammers, antler picks, wooden sledges, and fiber rope, have confirmed it is physically possible to quarry, shape, and move stones of this size with large coordinated groups of people, likely dozens working in shifts over months. Possible does not mean simple. It means this required planning, food surplus to support the workers, and some form of organizing authority or shared ritual purpose, strong enough to coordinate labor at a scale we don't associate with hunter-gatherer societies. That, more than any single carving, is the real anomaly here. The site is evidence. That large-scale cooperative behavior, the kind of social organization we use to think required settled agricultural life first, may have come before farming, not after it. Some researchers now argue the reverse of the old model entirely, that the need to feed and support the workers gathering for these massive building projects may have helped drive the shift toward cultivating grain rather than farming coming first and monuments following once people had free time. That single idea, if it holds up under continued research, is arguably a bigger revision to the standard story of civilization than any myth about hidden star codes. It's worth pausing on just how coordinated this labor had to be, because it's easy to say dozens of workers and move on without letting the logistics sink in. The nearest quarries with suitable limestone sit a few hundred meters from the enclosures, and even that short distance means dragging multi-ton blocks across uneven, sloped terrain without wheeled vehicles or animal power. Estimates from experimental archaeology suggest moving a single large pillar likely required anywhere from dozens to as many as a few hundred people working in coordinated pulls, using wooden sledges, rope made from plant fiber or animal sinew, and possibly a greased or wetted track to reduce friction. Feeding and housing that many workers, even temporarily during a construction campaign, requires stored food, water access, and some form of social organization capable of directing that many people toward a shared, non-immediate goal, which is a meaningfully different kind of cooperation than what's needed to organize a hunting party or a seasonal camp. Animal bone deposits, found across the site, dominated by wild gazelle and aurochs, remains in numbers far exceeding ordinary domestic consumption, along with large stone vessels that some researchers argue could have been used for brewing or large batch food and drink preparation, support the idea that the site hosted large communal feasting events, likely tied to the building or ritual use of the enclosures. In other words, the evidence increasingly points toward periodic mass gatherings, work, feasting, and ceremony rolled into the same events. W. Hitches a strikingly different picture of hunter-gatherer life than small band roaming for food, and it's a picture built from stone tools, animal bone, and pollen samples, not from speculation. Now, about the burial. For years, popular accounts of Göbekli Tepe repeated the idea that the enclosures were deliberately and ritually entombed all at once, buried on purpose by the people who built them, sealed as some kind of intentional closing ceremony. It's a dramatic image, and it shows up constantly in viral content. The archaeological reality is messier and more honest, and honestly still not fully settled. Some of the fill inside the enclosures does appear to include deliberately deposited material, rubble, animal bone, and worked stone fragments, and Schmidt himself argued parts of it were intentional backfilling. But more recent analysis, including work published by researchers reassessing the site's stratigraphy in the last several years, suggests the picture is more complicated. Parts of the fill likely accumulated through natural erosion, sediment washing down off the surrounding slopes over centuries, mixed with debris from ongoing use and reuse of the enclosures, rather than one dramatic, high-coordinated burial event. What is well established is that the site was in active use over an extremely long span, potentially close to 1,000 years, with older enclosure as partially filled in and newer, smaller ones built nearby or even inside the older rings. Whether that reflects a single grand ritual or centuries of ordinary maintenance and reconstruction, the way any long-used sacred site accumulates layers, is still an open, actively debated question among the archaeologists working the site today, not a solved mystery. There is a real observation buried in a lot of the viral retellings that's worth pulling out and stating accurately, because it is genuinely interesting on its own terms. Some of the earliest, deepest enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, including the two most famous ones, Enclosure C and Enclosure D, feature some of the largest and most elaborately carved pillars at the site, while, several later, smaller enclosures built in subsequent centuries show simpler construction and less monumental scale. This has led some researchers to note that the site does not show a clean, steady arc of improvement over time the way you might expect if craftsmanship were simply developing and refining itself generation after generation. That is a legitimate point of discussion in the literature. It is also not proof of a lost, more advanced civilization. Preceding the builders and serious archaeologists studying the site do not treat it that way. A far more mundane explanation fits the evidence better. Early construction phases may have drawn on a larger, more concentrated pool of labor and resources. During a peak period of use, with later smaller enclosures reflecting a period of declining investment shifting priorities, or a smaller community managing the site as the wider Tash Tepeler region developed other competing monumental centers nearby. Hat is not decline of knowledge across generations in some mystical sense. It is the ordinary rhythm of a site rising and falling in importance over the better part of a millennium, which is exactly what you'd expect from any long-lived ceremonial center in any period of history. Which brings us to the part of the story people can't resist, the vulture stone, formerly known as Pillar 43, found in Enclosure D. It shows a vulture with an outstretched wing, a scorpion, other animal figures, and a prominent circular disc, positioned above the vulture's wing. In 2017, an engineer named Martin Sweatman, working with a colleague from the University of Edinburgh, published a peer-reviewed paper proposing that these figures were not decorative but represented constellations, and that the disk symbol might represent a comet. Sweatman connected this to something called the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, the idea that a fragmented comet struck or exploded over the Earth around 12,900 years ago, potentially triggering a sudden sharp return to near-glacial Koa, LD, after the planet had already begun warming out of the last ice age. The proposal was that Pillar 43 might be a symbolic record of that event. A follow-up study published in the journal Time and Mind in 2024 revisited the pillar's imagery and offered further astronomical interpretation along similar lines. I want to be precise about where this actually stands in the scientific community, because it matters. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis itself remains genuinely contested among geologists and climate scientists. Some researchers point to nanodiamonds, platinum spikes, and impact-like marker S in sediment layers from that period as supporting evidence, while a significant number of other specialists argue the sudden cooling can be explained by more conventional causes, like a shift in North Atlantic Ocean circulation triggered by glacial meltwater, without invoking a cosmic impact at all. Anne Sweatman's specific reading of Pillar 43 as an intentional astronomical star chart has been met with real skepticism from Göbekli Tepe's own excavation team and other Neolithic specialists, who point out that reading modern constellation boundaries backward onto Ice Age carvings assumes the builders divided the sky the same way late our Mesopotamian or Greek astronomers eventually would, which is far from proven. So the honest answer is that this is a live, unresolved scientific argument, not a decoded message, and not a debunked fantasy either. It sits in the genuinely uncertain middle, which is a much more interesting place for a real mystery to live than a clean answer either way. What's easy to lose in all of this speculation about codes and comets is how much has actually been confirmed at the site through patient, unglamorous fieldwork, and how much of it has changed just in the last year. For a long time, the dominant theory held that Göbekli Tepe was purely ceremonial, a gathering place with no permanent residence, visited periodically by scattered hunter-gatherer groups who came together for ritual purposes and then dispersed. Excavations completed in 2025, led by dig director Necmi Karl, have started to complicate that picture. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted that season identified traces of rectangular planned structures near the monumental enclosures, structures that researchers believe may have functioned as dwellings, suggesting the site may have supported at least a semi-permanent population, rather than being purely a destination for pilgrimage. The same season produced a striking new find, a human statue with a clearly defined head and torso uncovered between enclosures B and D, adding to a small but growing collection of anthropomorphic sculpture at the site, distinct from the far more common animal reliefs. A related discovery, a human figure with a deliberately stitched mouth found nearby, is interpreted by researchers as a possible depiction of the dead, adding to evidence that the site had connections to funerary or ancestor-focused ritual, not purely a generalized nature worship of animals. And this fits into a much bigger picture. Göbekli Tepe is not an isolated anomaly sitting alone in the landscape. It's the best-known site in a wider network now called the Taş Tepeler, or Stone Hills Project, which includes at least a dozen related sites across the same region, among them Karahan Tepe, where a 2.5-meter human statue with strikingly realistic facial detail was found attached to a stone bench, the largest known sculpture of its kind from this entire period. Other sites in the network, including Sabers and Sifr Tepe, have produced their own distinctive finds, among them a carved wall panel at Sabers depicting a narrative scene, two men flanking what appears to be a bull alongside a leopard, one of the only examples from this period that looks like it's telling a specific story rather than presenting isolated symbolic figures. Turkey's Ministry of Culture and Tourism, presenting the project's findings publicly at the end of 2025, described the combined discoveries across these sites as pointing to a level of symbolic complexity, ritual behavior, and social organization considerably beyond what researchers assumed hunter-gatherer communities were capable of even a decade ago. Together, these sites are painting a picture of a whole cultural landscape of monument-building communities across southeastern Anatolia, roughly 12. 1,000 years ago, not one lone miracle on one hill, but a broader Neolithic transformation happening in parallel across the region, which arguably makes the whole picture more impressive, not less. And here's a number that puts everything else in perspective. Despite 3 decades of excavation, roughly 90% of Göbekli Tepe remains unexcavated. Archaeologists working the site estimate it could take another century or more to fully uncover it. Ground-penetrating radar has already identified at least 15 additional enclosures still buried beneath the surface, and researchers, including Dr. Mehmet Onal of Harran University, have suggested that one of these buried structures could date back as far as 13,000 BCE, older than anything excavated so far. That means everything you've just heard, the T-pillars, the animal reliefs, the human statues, the debated star chart, all of it comes from roughly 1/10 of the site. The genuinely honest and genuinely thrilling statement any real archaeologist working there will make is not that the mystery has been solved, it's that we are still near the beginning of understanding what this place actually is. It's also worth being fair to where the pseudo-archaeology around this site actually comes from, because it didn't appear out of nowhere. Klaus Schmidt himself sometimes used bold, quotable language, describing Göbekli Tepe early on as possibly the first human-built holy place. Language that was scientifically cautious in context, but travels well out of context. The genuine scale of the anomaly, monumental architecture with no obvious precursor, built by people without. Agriculture, metal, or writing is exactly the kind of gap that speculative theories rush to fill with dramatic explanations. Lost advanced civilizations, extraterrestrial contact, precise ancient astronomy. Encoded generations before anyone thought it possible. A 2023 academic review published in the journal Open Archaeology addressed this directly, noting that Göbekli Tepe has become, in the reviewer's words, a locus of speculation across disciplines from astronomy to psychology, inspiring theories connecting the site to the Garden of Eden, a technologically advanced pre-Ice Age civilization, or extraterrestrial visitors. None of those claims have supporting physical evidence at the site. No metal tools, no anomalous materials, no artifacts inconsistent with a Neolithic stone tool-using culture have ever been recovered. Either. Despite 3 decades of careful excavation by multiple international teams, the gap in our knowledge is real. The urge to fill that gap with something more cinematic than we don't fully know yet is understandable, but it isn't evidence, and dressing that same impulse up as an AI-generated discovery just gives it a modern coat of paint. So why does a fake AI decoded the code story spread as easily as it does? Partly because the real history is complicated and slow, built out of radiocarbon dates, stratigraphy reports, and careful peer review, while a story about a machine instantly and satisfying in under 10 minutes. Partly because Göbekli Tepe genuinely does upend assumptions people carry about the ancient past. So it's fertile ground for claims that go further than the evidence, dressed up with the borrowed authority of AI or science, to make them sound verified when they are. And it. There is no team of scientists who fed Grok every scan of this site and received a revelation about lost civilizations. What there is a hillside in Turkey, where hunter-gatherers who had not yet invented farming, pottery, metal tools, or the wheel organized themselves well enough to quarry, carve, and raise stones. The weight of loaded trucks into rings decorated with animals and figures we still don't fully understand was ugly 6,000 years before anyone thought that kind of achievement was possible. They did that with nothing but stone tools, coordinated labor, and whatever belief or purpose was strong enough to hold a community together across generations of building. If that doesn't sound remarkable enough on its own to you, I'm not sure a fabricated chatbot story was ever going to satisfy you either. Think about what actually has to be true for this site to exist. People with no writing system had to plan a construction project spanning years, possibly decades. People with no calendar in the modern sense had to coordinate gatherings large enough to move stones the weight of loaded trucks. People here with no permanent political institutions, as far as we can tell, had to sustain enough shared purpose to keep building generation after generation for the better part of 1,000 years, and then to keep reusing, modifying, and maintaining that same sacred ground long after the original builders had died. That is not a footnote in human history. Ori, that is a fundamental data point about what human beings were capable of organizing before any of the tools we usually credit with making civilization possible had been invented. We used to think belief and monument building were what settled farming societies did once they had free time. Göbekli Tepe suggests it might have been the other way around, that shared belief and the desire to build something permanent together may have been part of what pulled scattered communities towards settling down in the first place. That's not a fringe theory whispered by an AI with no accountability. It's a live, serious argument being made by the archaeologists who have spent their careers with their hands in that dirt, and it's still being tested, refined, and argued over every excavation season. That's the real story, as far as the evidence, not the algorithm, currently allows us to tell it. If you want to keep following where the actual excavation goes next, subscribe, because Göbekli Tepe is still less than 1/10 uncovered, and everything we think we know about it right now is likely to be revised again the next time a shovel breaks new ground on that hill. Let me know in the comments which of these findings surprised you the most, and which real archaeological mystery you want covered next.